I'm David Wilcove, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's Bradford seminar speaker, sponsored by the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment. And our speaker today is Willa Chaves from Virginia Tech University. Now, by way of background, I should say that Willa was born in the Brazilian Amazon. And while birthplace is rarely a key factor in introducing people, I think you will see from her seminar that whereas you can take the child out of the Amazon, you can't take the Amazon out of the child. She received her bachelor's degree at the Universidade Federal do Acre in Brazil, and then went to the University of Florida for her doctorate. Willa's interests have centered on human decision-making as it affects conservation. And in particular, she's interested in what motivates people to do the things they do that affect biodiversity. That was clear from her doctoral research, which focused on the consumption of wild game by people living in the Brazilian Amazon. And it involved some ingenious work whereby she provided people with vouchers for things like chicken or other domesticated meat to see if that would dissuade them from eating wild animals and what impact that might have on populations of wild animals in the Amazon. That work deftly combined ecology with economics and psychology, and indeed that's been a hallmark of Willa's work ever since, because she's trying to understand the interplay of both the social sciences as they reflect human behavior and ecology as it reflects impacts to animal populations to develop viable solutions to harmful practices with respect to biodiversity. After her doctorate, Willa came to Princeton, where she was a postdoc in the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment. And there she focused her attention on the issue of urbanization, and in particular, how the movement of people from rural areas to cities of different sizes affects their consumption behavior with respect to wild animals. This fall, she joined the faculty at Virginia Tech, where she is now an assistant professor in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation. It is my pleasure to welcome Willa back to Princeton. Willa Chaves.
Thank you so much, David, for the lovely introduction. And welcome, everybody. I am so excited that we're all here, and I'm excited to be back in Princeton, even if virtually. So I will start sharing my screen with you, and so we can start this conversation. Do you see the main view?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I will talk about some of the work I have been doing for the last few years. And David talked a little bit about some of those things. And as you can see from my title, I will be talking a lot about urbanization and consumption of wildlife in urban areas. And just to give you an idea of what I'm covering today, I will just give a very short background where I came from, although David already kind of introduced that, and why I work on wildlife trade. And then I will focus most of my work, most of my talk on three main things that I have been working on for the last few years. One is of my PhD work on behavior change and how we can affect behavior change in urban areas. Then I will talk about how we can assess sensitive behavior, because wildlife trade is illegal in Brazil. And then the last part is on how urbanization and rural to urban migration affect the consumption of wildlife in the Amazon. And then I will briefly talk about some next steps that I'm planning to take. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about where I come from. I was born in the Amazon, and I grew up in a small town. And so growing up there, I spent a lot of time in the rural areas with my family. And so we fished a lot, and I spent a lot of time in close to the forest and watching wildlife. And since very early on, I developed this fascination with biodiversity and wildlife and the forest. But I also had some other layer of relationship with the forest as well. My father hunted a lot to support our family. And growing up in the Amazon, I ate a lot of the wildlife that are commonly consumed there. Mammals, birds, tortoises, some of them endangered, threatened. And so this relationship with the way I grew up and the way that my family used and interact with the environment had a major role in the way I decided to work with conservation. And so this issue of wildlife trade and the work in the Amazon and work with people in the Amazon is very personal to me, and something that's really part of who I am. But that's not just a personal issue for me. Wildlife trade is a major threat to biodiversity. It's a multi-billion-dollar business that is driving a lot of species towards extinction. And we know that about 18% of terrestrial vertebrates are now affected by wildlife trade. And wildlife trade is one major driver of species decline. And so that the species that are traded are at higher categories of threat than the species that are not traded. So people trade wildlife and they demand wildlife for several reasons. Pets, to keep us pet, meat, traditional medicine, and ornaments, trinkets. So there are many uses for wildlife. And one that I am going to focus today is on the demand for meat, for the food. So most of my work has been conducted through the lens of wildlife trade, because I think it's a global threat to biodiversity, but it's an underappreciated global threat. People haven't been giving as much attention, although we have been talking a lot about that lately because of the pandemic and the likely origin of the virus that is causing this pandemic. This is an issue that we need to use people from different fields, the natural sciences, the social science, policymakers, bring them together to find solutions to solve this issue. And that's what I have been doing for several years now, trying to find solutions for this problem, which is a very complex and difficult problem to address. So today I will focus the talk mostly on three major things that I worked on in the last few years. Starting with the work that I did for my PhD, where I tried to see what we could do to change behavior of people in urban areas. So most of the work I have done focused on the demand side of the issue, and that's what I will be talking about today. So for the behavior change, we want to see whether we could change the consumption away from wildlife and towards other kinds of meat, just as a way to see if some of strategies would be effective. And I did that in a small town of Tapauá in Amazonas State. It's a town that's surrounded by protected areas in indigenous land. And at the time, we identified overhunting as a major threat to species there. So I started the work with the assessment of consumers to understand some of their motivations. And throughout this talk, I will mention here, I use the term wild meat to mean meat from wild animals, sometimes called game meat or bush meat. And so we first went to this place and we did some focus groups, in-depth interview. We talked to the people to try to see what was seen as benefits to consuming wildlife, and what were some of the barriers to behavior change. So after doing that preliminary research, we identified some important benefits of wildlife. One was taste preference. People really like the taste of wildlife. Diversity that it brings to their diet. There are many species. And growing up eating a lot of different species, I can understand that really well. And then price of the wildlife, which was much cheaper than that of wild meat, of domesticated meat, such as beef and chicken. And the barriers that they saw to changing the behavior was mainly the price of the alternatives. There was chicken and beef and fish as well, but mainly the chicken and beef were much more expensive. And then also the lack of alternative. There were just very few things for them to eat besides fish and wildlife. But we also identified that they cooked their meals in very simple ways. They boiled, they fried with very few spices. So we saw that as an opportunity and as a potential to diversify their diet by diversifying recipes that they could use in their daily consumption of domesticated meat. And we focused then our work on trying to switch away from wildlife towards more domesticated meat and fish, but we focused on small-bodied animals such as chicken and pork, and also on fish, which is a very important and a highly consumed type of animal source of food. So after we conducted this preliminary research, we decided to use a social marketing approach, and I use here three categories here to define what kinds of treatment we used for this. One was an information campaign, community engagement, and economic incentive. And before we actually implemented that, we did some pilot testing to see whether this worked at a very small scale before we actually tested that to the whole town. The model, the theory that we based this work was the theory of planned behavior, a modified version of it. So in this case, consumption was best predicted by the intention of consuming that meat, which was influenced by people's attitudes toward wildlife trade, their taste preference for wildlife versus domesticated meat, their perceived ability to cook and buy other kinds of meat, including chicken, and that was influenced by their knowledge of wildlife, their knowledge of different recipes that they can cook domesticated meat, and by the price of domesticated meat. And we also based the price part that I will talk more about in a little bit. We based this price change and try to reduce price of domesticated meat on two models of the economic theory. One is the price elasticity of demand, the own price elasticity of demand, which is a percent change in quantity demand as a result of a percent change in the price. And so following the law of demand, it would be if we reduce the price of chicken, we would expect the quantity demand for chicken would increase. And for the wild meat, we use the cross price elasticity of demand. And so assuming that chicken and wild meat were dietary substitute, then a change in price of chicken would lead to a change in the quantity demand for wildlife. And so if they were dietary substitute, we would expect that a decreasing price of chicken would decrease the quantity demand for wildlife. So going to our treatments, we had 3 treatments. So one was the information campaign, was a mass media, and we used radio and car with speakers. People that have been in the towns in the Amazon, they can imagine how those are. You have big speakers in cars that you can use as the major source of communication with people. And then visual media was another approach, in print media. And we focused on two main messages. One was about the wildlife and the wildlife conservation based on our preliminary research that showed some concerns that people had, talking about the concern that those people had and calling for action to reduce consumption of wildlife. And then the other part was promoting domesticated meat, and then we focused on chicken and pork, and also promoting some fish. And we did that by putting together a cooking book with many different kinds of recipes that people could use with local ingredients and using chicken, pork, or fish to cook. And that information campaign reached most people in town, and we assessed that before and after, and we saw that there was an increase in knowledge about wildlife conservation, but there was no changing attitudes, no changing behavior with just the information campaign. And then for the cooking, for the community engagement, we had door-to-door visits with conversations and reflections about the behavior. We also invited a lot of the households in town to participate in cooking courses. That was by far one of the most popular things we did in our campaign, where we taught some of the very recipes that we had in our cooking book. And we also asked them for a commitment that they made, a public commitment to reduce consumption of wildlife in their household. That community engagement approach was the most successful one in our campaign. And people increased their knowledge, they changed their attitudes about wildlife trade, they increased their preference for chicken and fish because of all the recipes that we taught how to cook. And they, most importantly, they reduced consumption of wildlife, mammals and birds in this case, by 62%. So it was successful when we had the information campaign together with the community engagement, because everybody was exposed to the information campaign, but this group was exposed, in addition to that, was exposed to the community engagement as well. And then we had the economic incentive. And so we determined after some evaluation about what was available locally, we thought that we needed to provide an incentive for something that was already present, because we could not increase production of domesticated meat. And the only one that was widely available for people that they could use was chicken. So we provided them with discount coupon for chicken, which they could redeem in the local grocery store. And with the coupons, the price of chicken became much lower than the price of wild meat. And then for our control group that we had, we also provided the same face value coupons, but for cleaning products. So to compare the effect of the coupon for chicken. And interestingly, yes, they ate more chicken. So there was an increase in quantity demand as a decrease in there was a decrease in price. They increased their demand for chicken. But there was no change in wildlife consumption as a result of the coupon. So people ate more meat in general when we gave them the coupon. And that's probably because they already eat a lot of chicken. So they are not going to replace chicken with the wild meat that they eat less often with the chicken that they already eat a lot. So chicken and wild meat was not substitute of one another for this particular study. So some of the conclusions here is that, yes, people will change their behavior if you provide it with the right context and right support for them to do it, and they did voluntarily. The economic incentive did not work, but I think that it's on a case-by-case basis, because in that particular place there were a lot of consumption of chicken already. People were already tired of eating too much chicken, and so maybe something else other than chicken that is culturally appropriate and acceptable for them might have a different result. This was successful at the local scale. I think the major challenge here is going to be to scale up. How do we scale up a reduction in consumption of wild meat? What else will people eat in replacement of the wildlife? That's not an easy question to answer, because we cannot shift that away from wildlife and say people stop eating wildlife and start eating more beef. That would be really bad, because beef production is a major driver of deforestation in the Amazon. So what else can we provide people at the very large scale so that there can be a substantial decrease of wildlife consumption in urban areas? And that's why this is such a complex issue that needs people from different fields, the natural science, the social science policymakers, to actually come up with solutions that work at the larger scale. So this was my work from my PhD, and then I wanted to look at the larger scale and see what was going on at the large scale, to try to understand what were the drivers of consumption and identify solutions that we can apply in this place. But unlike my PhD, where I spent 2 years there and I didn't start collecting data until 6 months after I was there, trying to develop a relationship with the community, a trusting relationship. It's really hard to collect data that's reliable, that's when the behavior is a sensitive behavior. So in Brazil, wildlife trade is illegal. Consumption of wildlife is illegal for most people. And so people may be afraid of talking about this issue. So we wanted to see what was the best way to approach that and collect reliable data on that reduced bias. So we set up this study to see whether asking directly to people, do you eat wildlife in your house? Versus an indirect method that I will explain in a moment, that protects participants' response by not connecting their answer to a particular behavior. And we wanted to look at that across urban context, from big city to large towns to small towns, and at different levels of consumption. And we wanted to look at that in the effect on prevalence of the behavior, comparing direct questions with this indirect one, and the factors that were associated with the behavior. So will our conclusion change depending on the methods that we use, and what does that mean for recommendations that we then make about what best interventions to do for conservation? So we did that in the state of Amazonas. It's the largest state in Brazil. It's about 20% of the Amazon basin. And we did that in the city of Manaus, which has more than 2 million people, and randomly select towns across the state to have a representative sample. And so we had 3 categories of urban areas, and we use here the Brazilian definition of urban area, which is the center of a municipality that provides services to urban services such as banks, markets, hospital, schools, and some diversity of labor and opportunities for people. And so we had 6 small towns in our sample, 3 large towns, in the city of Manaus. And we did household surveys with about 1,500 household surveys across the state. And we used two methods. We used the direct method, where we, one portion of that sample we did, we just asked people, do you eat wildlife in your house? And then we did a separate sample where we did a randomized response technique, which has been around for a while in the social science, but only more recently has been used in conservation context. And for this work, we used the unrelated question design, and I developed, the unrelated question design has been around for a while, but for the context of the Amazon, we developed this tool with 6 pieces of dominoes where people could randomly select from a bag. So I have a bag here. And so people could shake the bag, and they had these 6 pieces of dominoes, and they would randomly pick one and look and see which one they got. So we asked them if they got the domino with 1 dot, then we would ask, they would answer the question as though I was asking about a drink. Bacaba is a drink that's commonly consumed in this state. And if they got the answer with, if they got the domino with 2 dots, then they would answer the questions as though I was asking about wildlife, in this case, mammals and birds. Then I would ask, do you eat this item in your house? And I didn't know which one they got, if wildlife or the drink, but I knew the probability of getting the wildlife because of the number of dominoes in the bag. And then we assessed the consumption of the drink as a separate sample to see how much they consumed in the drink. And with that, with those pieces of information, we could model the consumption, even though I didn't know if a particular participant consumed or not. And with that, the idea is that we can increase more on, encourage more honest response. We did that for mammals and birds. We also did that for turtles and tortoises, using the cornmeal, which is another commonly consumed item in the region. And we used the same logic. And then we used as a negative control fish and acai, which is a regional drink, because fish is not a sensitive issue. Everybody eats fish. People don't have a problem talking about their consumption of fish. So we expected that for the case of fish, consumption would be the same, both in terms of their prevalence of consumption, in terms of the drivers of consumption. We would expect the same using the direct method, asking directly the question, or using this specialized technique. And then we use some predictors to see how those predictors were associated with consumption. So years living in urban areas, age, a poverty index, which the higher the index, the poorer the family is, number of people in the household, and whether they had children in the household. And so we did some logistic regression using Bayesian statistics. And the premise of this method is that you can model consumption as a function of some factor, some variable. In this case, consumption as a function of years that you have been in the city. And you can measure the bacaba consumption, which is the drink, and then you model that. And then you can ask about bacaba plus wild meat, and then you can model that as well. And you also know that the probability of consuming, or the probability of getting the drink versus the wildlife, you also have that probability. And with those pieces of information, you can model a third line that we can't see, but you can model, even though we don't know who exactly eats or doesn't eat. So using that approach, we got to these results. You see, for the left side here, fish, the proportion of households that consume was the same regardless of the method used. because fish, as I mentioned, is not a sensitive issue. So we expected that to happen. But if you look for mammals and birds and turtles, this is a very different picture. Looking at the small towns, there's no difference between the two methods. And you can see that the proportion of consumption is really high. But as you go to the bigger cities, large towns in big cities, you see that people are less likely to say they consume if you ask them directly. And the difference increases as you go to the big city. So if you ask them directly, you would underestimate consumption in the larger places, larger cities. In these small towns, it seems like there is no difference. People are not as afraid of talking about the issue because it's so high, the consumption, it's probably a social norm for them and not as sensitive. And then for what conclusions we get when we ask that also depended on the methods. For the fish, we had no differences in the conclusion. So I didn't put here, but there was no difference between conclusions between the two methods for fish. But for mammals and birds and turtles, there were some major differences in conclusions. So if we ask people directly about consumption, people who have been in town for a shorter period, they tend to underreport more. But if you ask indirectly, then you can see there is a trend. When people are in the town for a short period of time, they eat more and then they decline their consumption over time. You wouldn't be able to see that pattern asking a direct question. For mammals and birds also, the age influences, but you can't detect if you ask directly. So people who are older tend to eat more, but older people also tend to underreport more than the younger people. So you wouldn't see a difference if you ask directly, but you can see there is a pattern of increasing with age. And for turtles, poverty is an important variable. So the poorer the family is, the less likely they are to consume. But also you can't see that if you don't ask. If you ask directly, you can't see that. You can only see that if you ask indirectly, because people at different places and different contexts, they have different levels of underreporting. So they are not underreporting at the same rate. It depends on the characteristic of the population. And you can see for the lower part, where it's the small towns, the difference between the two methods are not doesn't seem to be very important. But as you go to bigger cities, and the difference kind of increases there. So some of the conclusions is that the sensitivity of a behavior will vary across urban contexts. And so if you ask the direct question, you may get biased conclusion both in terms of the prevalence of the behavior and also what is driving the behavior. And that has major implication for what kind of intervention you would recommend as a result. So with that, I go to the next and last part of my presentation, which is the urbanization and the rural-urban migration. So we want to see how this process of urbanization and rural migration affect consumption. So we know that most people now live in urban areas, right? And this trend is likely to continue, driven in part by migration of people from rural to urban area. So you can see from this graph, less than 35% of people living in urban areas in 1960 to more than 55% in 2018. We wanted to know what that meant for wildlife. So do people decrease their consumption over time? Does the consumption vary with the size of urban area, and how that changes from adults to children? We used that here, we used the turtles and tortoises as a model, because there was one of the this group is one of the most heavily consumed, harvested group in the Amazon. And we want to know how that influenced the consumption of turtles and tortoises. And we have 5 species of turtles that are heavily consumed, and they are all threatened in the Amazon that are heavily consumed. They are all threatened. And we have 2 species of tortoises that's also heavily consumed. One is vulnerable and the other one is considered nearly threatened. We did the work in the same place using the same sampling design, the big city, large towns, and the small towns. The Amazon, like many other places in the world, has more people living in urban areas. And you think of the Amazon, you don't think about cities and big cities and in urban environment, but 72% of the people live there in the city, as opposed to 28% of people living in rural areas. We use the same as research design here with small towns, large towns, and the big city, and looking across and seeing how the consumption changes with urbanization and rural to urban migration. We did surveys, the same 1,500 household surveys randomly selected across the cities. And we also looked at the school children because we wanted to see consumption of adults versus children. And we looked at middle and high school kids from 12 to 17 years old, about 2,500 anonymous questionnaire that we applied to children. For the household, we had some predictive variables, and the main one was the urban area type, small town, large town, and the city of Manaus. But we were interested in whether the people had migrated from rural to urban areas, or if they always lived in urban areas. So I will refer to migrants here to refer to those people who have lived in rural areas and moved to urban areas. So we are not talking about urban to urban migration, but rural to urban migration. And the ones that never lived in rural areas, I'm calling here non-migrants. And we used poverty also as a predictor variable, birthplace, whether they were born in a small town, rural areas, or the city, the big city, or in Manaus or elsewhere, a big city, whether they had children in the household, in the season, because whether it's a dry season or wet season really can influence consumption here. We used the same method that I explained before with the same pieces of dominoes, and we looked at the consumption of turtles and tortoises. But here we used not just the probability of consumption. We wanted to ask them about whether they consumed or not, but also the amount consumed. So we asked them how many units they ate per week, per month, or per season, depending on the frequency of their consumption. And we used 2 kinds of analysis, so logistic regression and negative binomial, to look at whether the proportion of people that consume and the number that of turtles that are consumed, and what were the drivers of that. For the children data, we looked at 2 kinds of response variables. The probability of consumption, both in the last time that turtle was available in a meal for them, and the other one was whenever it's available, whether they eat or not, or how likely they are to eat, and the last time they eat. or the last time it was available. And then the preference was another one from 0 that they don't like all the way to 5 if they like it a lot. And the results were for the small town, there was a big proportion of the population of the people in town that consume. So we have proportion in the y-axis here. 85% of people in small towns consume during the high season, the dry season, where there's a nesting season where it's easier to find turtles. Large towns also, about 62% of the households consume during the high season, and then about 39% of people of the households consume in the large city, which is much higher than we thought. We thought would be much lower than that. So it's really a high demand. And during the low season, which I call the low season, which is the wet season for turtles here, there's a much lower consumption of it, but there's still some consumption throughout the year for some households. In terms of consumption probability, poverty was an important factor associated with consumption. So wealthier households were more likely to consume turtle, and that makes sense because turtles are kind of expensive and not a lot of people can consume unless they have direct access or can fish themselves or harvest themselves. So there was a decrease in consumption, like about a 1% decrease for every increase in 1% of the poverty probability index. So the poorer the family was, the less likely they were to consume turtles. In terms of number of turtles consumed, well, the kind of residents really influenced the level of consumption. So the ones that had the highest consumption were migrants that migrated from rural areas to small towns. So that's the dotted line on the top there. So small towns, migrants, rural to urban areas that migrated to a small town had the highest rate of consumption. And then everybody else that migrated or always lived in urban area had a lower consumption rate. And then if you move to a large town or to the city, your consumption rate is lower as well. Among those that moved from rural areas to urban areas, so the migrants here, the longer you have been in the city, the less likely you are to consume turtles. And the pattern holds for the number of turtles consumed among those migrants as well. So the longer you are in the city, the less likely, the fewer turtles you eat over time. So there's a decline in consumption with time for all kinds of urban areas. For the households that had children, they had a lower consumption, 61% of consumption. They ate 61% fewer turtles when they had children in the household than when they didn't have children in the household. We have a rough estimate of about 1.7 million turtles being consumed annually in the state when we extrapolate the categories of towns to the whole state. And Manaus accounts for 1/3 because although Manaus, the rate of consumption in Manaus is much lower, the number of people in Manaus is much bigger. There's more than half of the population of the state is in this big city. There was a big difference between the consumption rates of children and adults, and also the preference. So children had a lower consumption probability and a lower taste preference than adults did. So there's a big change or big difference between adults and children regarding consumption and preference. And there is also a big difference between among children that live in small towns, large towns, and the big city. So the small town here are children, the dotted line are children that live in small towns. So compared to children who live in small towns, large towns children in Manaus, children who lived in Manaus, are much less likely to eat turtles whenever is available. They were much less likely to eat when was available last time in a meal, and they have a lower taste preference. So it looks like the bigger the city, the lower the consumption, the lower the taste preference. And that is very similar to what we saw with the adults as well. So here are some of the conclusions we have for this part of the work is that wildlife consumption appears to be a rural tradition. And as people move to the city, they keep that tradition, but over time they reduce consumption. Perhaps because they are more used to alternatives in the city, or because they lose some of their connections in the rural areas. But the fact is that over time they reduce the consumption. And then the bigger the city, the lower the consumption rate. And that consumption always also change from adults to children. Children are much less likely to eat turtles than adults. One of the things about the work is that today, most of the work that's done to conserve turtles and wildlife, it's really focused on protected areas enforcement. And for turtles is protection of nesting sites, which is certainly a very important intervention, and probably have kept some of these species from going extinct locally or even as a species. But if we are to address this issue of overconsumption or wildlife trade, we need to address the urban areas. This demand is still there, even though we are trying to protect the beaches. Turtles are still going every year to the urban areas. And our work shows that the people that have the highest rate of consumption are the ones that just moved to the city. And so working with those people may have bigger return on investment than just working with the general population. And working with children to create this, raise awareness or create this stewardship for wildlife, to see if we can keep their decisions as they grow older. Right now, they are less likely to eat turtles. If that's going to change over time, we don't know. But if we work with children, then now it may be less likely, they might be more likely to keep eating fewer turtles as they grow up. And that will cause a big change in the next generation if that happens. But we don't know what's going to happen with the children's behavior as they grow older. I am working with Brazilian collaborators to try to find some ways that we can move forward with that and create some interventions that we can test locally to see what would be the best approaches then to think about how to test those pilot interventions and how can we then scale up afterwards. So with that, my next steps, I'm still collaborating with Dr. Wilkoff's lab, with Liang Ma, who is a postdoc in Dr. Wilkoff's lab. We are trying to build some predictive models to see how consumption will change over time, given what we know about declines in consumption or as people are for longer in the urban areas. We are trying to predict that for the next 15 years for wildlife and fish. One thing that I want to do is to see how big consumption in the rural area is. We have a lot of studies on hunting and use of wildlife, but as far as I know, there's no large-scale quantitative assessment of how much is being consumed in the rural areas to understand the relative importance of that consumption, rural versus urban. One thing I want to look next is to see how rural-urban mobility of people from rural to urban areas, how that influences the trade, and then the transportation network, how that affects the trade of wildlife in the Amazon and of vulnerable species as well, such as Arapaima and the blackfin pacu, for example. And then, like I mentioned before, I wanted to identify and implement some interventions in the next few years to see which ones work best in what context, to then try to move forward with these approaches. And that will require working with people from the natural science, social science, and policymakers to see, okay, we want people to eat fewer turtles or less wildlife in the urban areas. What else can be done so that we can make sure that people are not exacerbate their food security in the urban areas, and that they replace wildlife with something that's not sustainable. So we don't want people to move away from wildlife to beef, for example. What else can we provide? How can we diversify their diets that is culturally appropriate and sustainable? So with that, I wanted to thank everybody for their time, and also all the organizations and people that worked with me. Those are some of the people, but there are many others that I want to thank. And yes, and thank you for your time.
Wila, thank you so much for a terrific seminar. I want to say that there are two ways that you can ask questions. If you raise your hand using the screen indication, I can call on you. Alternatively, you can enter your question in the question and answer, the Q&A box on your screens as well. And Wila, we have a couple of questions that have come in. The first comes from Jordan Stoltzfus, who noted that there's been a lot of attention given to overt habitat destruction in the Amazon, but that the issue of wildlife exploitation, much less well known. Can you make a rough assessment of the relative impacts of those two on biodiversity?
On habitat conversion and
versus overexploitation?
That's a very good question. I think it will depend on where you are in the Amazon. I think that yes, habitat conversion is the biggest threat to the Amazon. But I think in a lot of places for the species that we are talking about, that's not going to be for all the species, but the targeted species suffer exploitation even when the habitat is still there. So for some species that are affected by this, you still have what looks like pristine forests and pristine habitat, like in the state of Amazonas. There is still very little deforestation compared to other states, but we don't know very much about how much is being drained there. So I think that, yes, I think both are very important, but for the wildlife, the species that are being traded, the wildlife harvest can precede conversion, sometimes by many years, and we think it's still a healthy forest or a healthy environment, but the big wildlife is not there. I won't answer the question of what is more important. This is a big debate, right? So I don't want to put myself in that predicament, but I think both are very important, but I think wildlife harvest has been given much less attention. And I have seen proposals of putting wildlife as one of the things that when you are talking about payment for ecosystem services, having wildlife management and having guarantees that there is still big species, big animals in that place might be a way to help wildlife while helping slow down conversion of the habitat as well.
Thank you, Wila. And Liana Sena wondered whether you could attribute the decrease in consumption of wild animals in urban areas to decreased access or to better law enforcement in urban areas, large cities versus small, or whether there may be other factors involved.
If we are looking at across the urban gradient, I think it's a mix of things, right? So in big cities, you have less access. So unless you have, people that come from rural areas that are bringing something for you, have connections, then it's much more difficult to get it. Plus, there's more enforcement. And plus, fewer people eat, so it's not a norm. So some people frown upon consuming wildlife, whereas in the small towns, it is part of the social norm. People think it's the normal thing to do, so people are not really afraid, and they know everybody. Everybody knows everybody in these small towns. So I think it's much easier from a social perspective, but also from the structure as well, more access and more part of social norm, because everybody consumes. And so you always know somebody who consumes and who can sell it. Whereas in the big city, unless you know a contact, then it's much more difficult to get it, and there is more enforcement. So it's a combination of things. It's hard to tease apart everything.
And Judith Dexter wondered whether you had any insights in whether the children's lowered interest in consuming wildlife relative to their parents in urban areas stemmed from any difference in the way children view the animals, say as pets, as opposed to food, relative to the way their parents viewed animals.
Right. I don't know. It's something I'm interested in understanding, how the view of nature, connection with nature, or opinions about the importance of wildlife, or view wildlife in a different way. We haven't done that we didn't do this in this work, but it's something I am interested in understanding more, to see if it's a social thing, like kids don't eat that, and it's like it's a seen as a rural thing, and they don't want to be rural anymore. We don't know. So it's important to assess that, and I would like to in the future.
And I'm curious to know, based on your earlier work showing that with a social campaign strategy, you could decrease or at least increase interest in eating domesticated animals versus wild-caught animals. What are the prospects for bringing a campaign of that sort up to scale in a large area like the Amazon? Are people readily connected via the web, or are there other ways in which you can do that at a large enough scale to make a difference?
Right. So if you're talking about small towns, it's much more difficult because internet is a real issue. I am collaborating in research now that's trying to do online survey, and Amazonas is really a data hole because people don't have access to the internet. So it's a limitation, and would have to be a much more localized using radio. People use a lot of WhatsApp, maybe that could be, which is like an app that you can use to communicate. It's even if you have limited access to the internet, you can use. So these small towns have more challenges in terms of technology, and then you go to large towns, that's a little bit easier, but still very challenging. But in the big city of Manaus, people have access to the internet more easily. But it would be more expensive to do something in Manaus, because to get everybody, you would have to do like a mass media more. And so, yeah, there are some trade-offs. the cost, logistic cost is higher for small towns, but then the big city also costs a lot to reach everybody. We would have to test which strategies would work the best, maybe working with communities instead of mass media, but working in neighborhoods where there's more migrants, recent migrants might be a way to start and learn from that.
Well, thank you very much. We have reached the end of our allotted time. I want to thank you for a really interesting and important seminar. And again, welcome you back to Princeton and hope that we see you again. And I want to thank our audience and wish everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.